The past will always have lessons to teach us, but the future's got some cool stuff to say too. Using nothing but hindsight, the linkage fork would be a dead end, but we've learned a lot since then. Materials, dampers, and even design philosophy have evolved, and the time has come for the trust components message fork. Maybe. When we get on a bike and want to feel like, oh, what's this fork feel like? You know, you stand next to it and you do that. If you do that on this fork, it's stiff. Like, it's a harsh feeling, like 130 millimeters of contoured travel. But if you push it up against something, if you put it up against a wall or a curb or something, it's really sensitive and supple. And I think that speaks to the benefit of this, of the direction of the impacts that you're going to encounter when you're riding are like that curb, they're like that wall, they're in front of you.
It's interesting because we've seen the rise of full suspension bikes that claim that they're better at square edge compliance and things where you're really hitting sharp edges at speed. And now we have a fork that's mimicking that too. We have this fork, which actually axle's moving at first behind you.
And some of the first trails that I tried it out on were really steep and rocky. And the kinds of trails that not only does sensitivity matter, but geometry matters, where you're just naturally gonna end up deep in the travel because of where your body is and because of what the bumps are gonna do. And that's another benefit of the message fork, is that slightly rearward axle path through the early part of the stroke decreases the offset. And now that offset is a buzzword in spec and fork design. That short offset makes your steering more stable.
It's an interesting sensation because we're used to telescoping fork. You dive down into it and you can combat that with getting the right pressure, running more volume spacers, that sort of thing. And forks are getting more sophisticated where you're more of the time higher in the travel. But regardless, you do something steeper like you're talking about, come off a drop, you're dropping into that fork and you're effectively steepening the head tube angle. But with this, it feels as though your handlebars, even though they're not staying at this height, it feels like they're almost riding at the same height, so that you're gaining the benefit of whatever the static head tube angle is. It feels as though it's that way as you're descending down through something steeper and through a lot of rough stuff. You kind of maintain that angle of attack.
And that predictability and consistency in ride position follows to the corners as well. Like when you're in a berm or in a G out or something, like it doesn't get any more squirrely, and it really supports you. I mean, we talk about rear suspension being supportive all the time. It's something we don't really follow to front suspension that often, and I think it does here. And not only just in the way the spring reacts, but in the fork chassis itself. I mean, it is a stiff, burly fork.
It's interesting because it's quite stiff. It's really laterally stiff. You mentioned cornering, and it feels stiff, but it still feels consistent, and it doesn't feel so harsh like if you ride carbon wheels that are unbelievably stiff. It feels like you're deflecting constantly. You're bouncing around.
I'll agree that when you're in a rough section, it doesn't have that deflecting you offline, too harsh sort of a feel laterally. But in a high-speed shunder, it doesn't feel as plush as a 130 or even 120 mil fork, I think, should in that type of scenario where you're not necessarily steep, you're not necessarily over the front end, you're kind of plowing through successive hits. It's not really a floater. And if you take something like this and like you take it off a jump, for example, especially if you land rear wheel first, you're not landing in a perfect, nice transition. It's reminds me of that initial pushing on the handlebars sort of feeling where you're just straight downward pressure. It's not frontward impact. It's just your body going into the fork, and it's not the greatest at that.
Certainly, and you noticed it also when you were going at speed with those successive hits, and that could be a little bit, you're hitting them really at speed at a little different angle. It's not allowing it to fully compress. Now I noticed, I rode this fork up in smoother terrain up in Marin County. It was more medium speed stuff. I didn't notice that situation until I came back down here to SoCal, riding at speed with a bunch of, hard hits back to back to back no break in between. That's where it became very different, the rear of the bike from the front of the bike. The front felt stiff. It felt as though it wasn't really even activating. The rear still felt smooth.
Some of what we felt can be chalked up to just how different the Message Fork is. But that limit we found to its high-speed capability, we chalked that up to our unreasonable expectations. This fork has the strength and stiffness of a Fox 36, and the price tag of 3 Fox 36s, but it turns out that doesn't mean it's meant for the same kind of riding as a Fox 36.
So the actual path the axle follows is 130 millimeters, but they're kind of pushing it as being more comparable to a 120 linear millimeters, and that's a pretty progressive 120 millimeters. I mean, there's a nice little sag indicator on here, and I kept checking it like after hitting some pretty big hits, and not necessarily feeling a harsh bottom out, but like being like, I must have gotten to 95%, and I'm still at like 75-80%. So it may even be less than that effective 120 millimeters. And like, when was the last time you rode a sub 120 mil Fox 36? I mean, it's kind of a strange beast.
It's definitely different, and you jump on a fork that is that stout feeling, and it immediately breeds this confidence where you want to go ride aggressively. You want to bash into stuff, because if you're on a little 120 millimeter fork, you jump on it and you can feel that it's not this Burly chassis, and it gives you a little bit of a tip off. I've got to ride within some limits here. This guy, it just feels Burly right out of the gate. Mm-hmm. So yes, 120, maybe 130 with that axle path, but it breeds this confidence that makes you want to test it.
And we tested it on a DaVinci Marshall, and it's a 110 millimeter rear travel, relatively progressive, and a pretty stout feeling frame. Like, it's something that you can thrash. It's a short travel thrasher bike, and it pairs really well with this fork as a short travel thrasher fork.
It's got some really interesting, different, unique things going on that are unique enough that they stand out. I haven't felt it before where it feels like my handlebars are in the same position, though obviously I'm using travel while descending something steep. I mean, that just is different, and it's a rad feeling. I also can't say that I've really felt a fork that somehow contours well over terrain while pressing into something and leaning the bike. It's very different. So yeah, maybe there are a few things that we have to adjust to, but it'd be really cool to see what's coming next and how this platform evolves. Maybe down the road we go, man, remember when we didn't used to ride linkage forks? Mm-hmm. Weren't we crazy? Or maybe we'll go, man, remember there was that linkage fork? Whatever happened to that?
It's not discouraging me from this concept. I mean, in fact, quite the opposite. It's making me want to look for what the next Message fork is going to be. I mean, this package seems like kind of an odd first choice out of the gate. I think if you can apply this concept to a longer travel platform, it'll alleviate a lot of the issues that we're having.
The Message Fork will, at least for a while, be a niche product. Maybe a little more niche than Trust Performance had hoped at first. But now that future iterations don't need to be tested in secrecy, maybe they'll combine the stability we liked with the plushness we want.